Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Megan Hesley, and I want to thank you in advance for participating in this month's webinar. We are providing complimentary webinars on a monthly basis that feature a variety of talent management topics. The topic of today's webinar is Uncovering the Potential of Personality at Work. Our presenters are Barbara Mackintosh, a talent management consultant here at TalentQuest, and Rachel Finglass, our Chief Relationship Officer. Before we get started, I just wanted to let everyone know that due to the large number of participants, we have muted the phone lines. If you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A box at the bottom right-hand corner of your online webinar, and we will address the questions at the end of the presentation. One final item is that we will be sending all participants the slideshow and audio of this webinar by the end of this week. Thank you again for participating in our webinar, and now I will turn it over to Barbara Mackintosh.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us. This is Barbara. Rachel Finglass and I appreciate your spending some time with us this afternoon to talk with what we feel are some innovative ways of uncovering the potential of personality at work. Specifically, some of you or all of you may be aware of the application of personality assessments and how they play a role at times in selection and determining whether or not an individual may be a good fit for a particular position based on their personality traits and whether or not those traits would lend themselves to success. In addition, they can also be used as a tool to promote self-awareness. Specifically, they can impact an individual's performance, their development, and also increase levels of emotional intelligence, which we'll go into in a little bit in a couple of slides. Also, they can be used as a tool to promote team awareness. So when we look at personality assessments and how they can impact team composition and team interactions, they can positively impact those dynamics and the effectiveness of teams overall. So today, again, sort of recapping, we touched on how personality assessments can play a role in selection and job fit. And when we talk about selection, it's not just their application in external roles or looking at candidates that might not currently be in your organization. They can also be used to assess candidates against future roles, so in the role of succession planning or if you're looking at potential promotion. But what we wanted to focus the webinar on today was how these tools can be helpful in, again, promoting self-awareness and individual development as well as team effectiveness. So how do they even impact those things, and why do we even care about self-awareness? What's the advantage of us having a better understanding of our personality? If you're familiar with the construct of emotional intelligence, it's really, and this is Howard Gardner's model, it's based on inter and intrapersonal intelligence. So it's an intelligent measure that is above and beyond some of the more traditional cognitive measures of intelligence. And the idea is the more self-awareness, social awareness, self-management, and relationship management that an individual has, the higher they're going to be on this construct of emotional intelligence. As it relates to personality, if an individual has a better understanding of sort of their natural tendencies that are as a result of their personality characteristics and their personality traits, just having that awareness can help them better manage their behaviors, manage their emotions, as well as how they are perceived socially and how others might perceive them, and therefore the individual might be better equipped to present themselves in a way that's going to be more advantageous depending on the particular situation in the workplace. So really today's presentation is looking specifically at how the awareness of one's personality, the awareness of a team's personality can help to increase these levels of emotional intelligence. So we've divided up the presentation into really two sections, and again, we encourage you to please, if you have questions throughout, use the chat screen. That's what it's for, down at the bottom right-hand corner of the webinar screen, and at the end, we will address those questions. But we want to talk first about individual development and performance improvement. So Rachel's going to walk you through that section, and then we'll spend a little bit of time on interpersonal relationships and team effectiveness and how personality assessments can play a role in those. So I'm going to turn it over to Rachel.
Okay, thank you, Barbara. So let's talk about using assessments for individual development. And again, we're going to think just very narrowly in terms of your own individual development or someone else's development. We really need to start with the question, though, can personality change really happen? Hey, I hate to throw it out there, because if not, why are we talking about personality and development, Rachel, if you're going to tell us that personality change can't really happen? We're going to hang up off this call. Well, you know what? When you're looking at measuring personality traits, we are, for the most part, looking at our kind of hardwired core personality traits and who we are. However, what can change over time are behaviors. So that's really what we're looking at here. We may still be the same person. We may be able to impact personality and certain traits more than others and change it a little, but we're not going to turn someone into someone they're not. But through self-awareness, you can start to impact behaviors. You can start to impact change. So, as I was saying, that it's really, I think self-awareness is a very key word for us to kind of focus in on this afternoon, because very much it is self-awareness. That's how you learn the behaviors and skills. That's also how you begin to notice the impact that you may have on others. So how does this particular personality trait impact when you're interacting with one sort of person versus with another? How is that one particular personality trait valuable in one role where it's an asset, and in another role at work it may be a bit of a hindrance? So we'll look at that. So even though we're not going to really turn someone into someone they're not, let's keep in mind that the easiest thing to do is to learn things that are consistent with our personalities. So we're not going to change us into someone we're not, but let's figure out what our strengths are, and let's apply those strengths to have the most success. All right, what you see in front of you, probably quite a few of you are familiar with the TalentQuest assessment and know this graph really well. For those of you who are not as familiar with it, let me do a quick overview and introduction of it for you. This is one model and one construct of personality, happens to be one that we measure with the TalentQuest assessment, but it is a highly, highly validated assessment, particularly for use in a business setting. And you see what we are measuring here are 16 different personality traits. And the traits are bipolar. There's a word on the left and a word on the right. So you can fall anywhere in this continuum from 1 to 10 on each of these 16 different personality traits. Now you may kind of think in your mind, well, an 8 must be better than a 2. It's a higher number, but it's not. These really are bipolar. You can score anywhere on that continuum. There's no value being more in one direction versus another. It really is just understanding who you are and then saying, okay, well, in this situation, in this role with this person, is that a positive? How do I leverage it? That sort of thing. So let's layer another lens here, kind of on top of, whoops, too many clicks. Another lens kind of on top of what we were looking at. And that's if we take a look here at this image to the right is simply a bell curve, just a standard bell curve. And the reason for showing you that is to kind of visually, if you placed a bell curve on each of these 16 traits, that's how the scores would fall if we went out and tested everybody in the population. They wouldn't fall in a flat 1 to 10. So in the very middle, the mean, that average of a 5.5, you see there's a lot of people who would score in that range. So not so differentiating of that individual. If you get to either extreme, and again, no value assigned to either side, 1s, 2s, 9s, 10s, you see under that bell curve not a lot of people would score at that level. It is a more distinguishing trait, a more defining trait, a more almost more extreme. The personality stands out more. So on either end here, those traits are harder to change. In the middle, they're more malleable. So again, as you think about what is a more defining personality trait that I want to measure, that I want to leverage, or similarly, wow, in this particular situation, how may that be something I need to be aware of? So let's try to apply this a little bit. We talked about already those more extreme scores to the left and right. Think about it can be an advantage in one situation, maybe a disadvantage in the other. Let's take a look at this graph in front of us. And this is what we were looking at, except for that now we have these red triangles that show you where this particular person scored on each of these traits. But that's all we know. We don't know if this is good or bad or whatever. Let's put our hat on and think in terms of this individual in a sales role, an outside sales role. So I've circled 3 traits. Controlling, where the person's almost a 7. Gregarious, where they're almost a 9. And unorganized, where they are a 4. As we think about this, and we'll discuss this more, but think about how may each of those traits help this person in a sales role. How may they cause problems? If this were a real life situation and this were you or someone that you're working with for development, think about, has there been any feedback around these traits in the past? And any other extreme scores we may want to consider besides the one I circled, or something you may naturally be looking for. So for controlling, that's kind of a very assertive, opinionated sort of personality trait. And in some situations, you can come across too assertive and too strong. But for this particular outside sales role, that trait is what's going to help this individual have that kind of drive and need to convince others of his opinion. So you, in that scenario, having higher on that controlling or assertiveness scale is a positive thing. Now the gregarious, this person is very kind of outgoing, external energy, exuberant, with the gregarious trait as a 9. Again, you'll frequently see that in an outside salesperson who is out meeting and greeting new people all the time. At that sort of level, this individual may need to stop and think in terms of how that energy level may be a bit overwhelming to some people at times, and where it could actually be a real asset in terms of moving in and meeting others. Now, on the kind of 3 level for that unorganized, I have a little bit of concern, because in this particular outside sales role, I know that there's a lot of follow-up and follow-through required on leads and on contacts that's necessary to close a deal and be successful in the outside sales role. So that's a concern. So that would be something that I'd want to look at in terms of the individual's self-awareness. It may be that if I were working with them in terms of their development, what kind of tools can I help them learn to use, whether it's task lists, keeping track of appointments in Outlook and using reminders. Maybe it's partnering with someone who's very detail-oriented, or having an assistant who's very detail-oriented to help us leverage those traits that are going to help this individual meet and greet and close the deals, but help put that structure underneath it all to help undergird it all and make the person be successful. So that's a very kind of applied example of how for individual development we may look at those 16 personality traits. So as we look back and think it through one more moment, you'll want to always think about what are the greatest strengths and how can we leverage those strengths. Are there any areas of opportunity or blind spots? And what development activities or resources can be used to build on strengths and address areas for opportunity? So again, it's about self-awareness. It's about leveraging strengths and trying to support areas that need further development. In the TalentQuest assessment report, just to click and show you real quickly before we start talking about using personality assessments for team, you are given, when you think about development, you are given choices and options in terms of books or videos or audios that you can use in terms of development based on specific limitations found in that particular assessment. As well as, okay, if you're working with someone, how do you coach them? How do you manage them for each area where there may be a potential limitation? Okay, I'm going to hand the mic back over to Barbara Mackintosh, and she's going to take a look at it now through the lens of working as a team.
Thanks, Rachel, and happy birthday, by the way. Okay, so now let's switch gears. Rachel touched on how these assessments can help an individual understand where they fall in the different traits and how they can best develop as well as grow professionally. But as we all know, in this day and age, we work in many situations in the workplace, we work in teams. And as we work in teams, we all come together with, or we all bring to the table different experiences, different backgrounds, different points of view. In addition, we bring different personality traits and characteristics. So just as it's important as a team and a high functioning team to have a good understanding of where those team members are coming from the standpoint of background experiences and points of view, it's also very helpful for teams to go through an exercise where they also have a common vocabulary for articulating where the team members are from a personality standpoint. So again, why assess personality in teams? It's going to provide you with that common vocabulary. You're going to understand yourself, you're going to understand others, and hopefully through that understanding, you'll be better equipped to effectively work through group dynamics. You can also anticipate and manage misunderstandings. I think this is probably one of the biggest advantages of implementing or of going through an exercise with a team where that team is going to gain a better understanding of their personality. And that's because you can sort of proactively say, okay, we've got this situation coming up. Our team's going to be faced with this challenge. And because of that, let's make sure we're all on the same page. Let's make sure that we don't put ourselves in a situation where misunderstandings can escalate to conflict. You can also, as you can capitalize on individual strengths, you can also capitalize on the team's strengths and then work to develop any sort of weaknesses or gaps or blind spots and understand how teams relate to other teams. So in an organization, not only do we work in teams, but many times we have teams that are working together, and each of those teams may have their own personality. So understanding your team's personality and understanding other teams that you might interact with, their personality, that also can be advantageous and help to lead to overall organizational effectiveness. If you're familiar with the 5 dysfunctions of a team, Patrick Lencioni just wanted to throw this graph up here, this graphic up here to show he has proposed that really there are 5 sort of major roadblocks to team success: the absence of trust, fear of conflict, a lack of commitment, avoidance of accountability, and or an intention to results. So how could personality awareness impact our ability to navigate around these? The idea being, really, when I look at this, I see trust, I see conflict, commitment. If a team has a better understanding of where team members are naturally stronger and or where they may struggle, it's going just to help to build not only organizational commitment, but also team commitment. So this is just something to show sort of the relationship between how we can use these assessments, how we can use our understanding of personality, and how that might help us to navigate around what might lead to dysfunction. So when when we're working with clients and we're talking about how personality can be integrated into looking at teams, there are really sort of three areas that come into play. The first is we all come to that team with our individual personalities. So we're a group of very unique people, and all of us are coming with that sort of personality infrastructure that, as Rachel mentioned, is really not going to change, or not something that we have the ability to change. We can change our behaviors, and awareness can help us do that. But as far as what our natural tendencies are as it relates to personality, there's not a lot that's going to change there. We've also got that internal team personality. So if we are working as a customer service team, our customer service team is probably going to have some traits that are more dominant than others, just as we as individuals do, and that might lend itself to our team behaving in a particular way. In addition, we've got external teams that we work with, as I mentioned earlier. So those team personalities are also going to impact how the organization can most effectively operate. Okay, So we're going to go through a kind of a mock example of a team personality composition exercise. But before we start, when we're interpreting team results, first we want to review the team results for each of the personality traits. So just as Rachel showed you the graph where you saw one data point for each of the personality trait continuums, bipolar continuums, we also want to look at the team and how all of the team members fall against those continuums. And we're going to ask a few questions as we look at and kind of sort of scan over the graph that you'll see in a few minutes. The first is, are scores evenly distributed across the scale? So when we're looking at a scale perhaps of people-oriented and solitary, do we really have everybody sort of placed at different places across, scattered across that continuum, or do we find that there are clusters either towards people-oriented or solitary in that example? As a group, which traits seem to be dominant? So again, going back to what Rachel was talking about earlier, when you see that normal distribution and you want to say, well, which traits are going to be more difficult for an individual to perhaps modify behavior based on what that natural tendency might be associated with that trait, it's going to be where those scores are falling above about 7.5 to 10 or below 4 to 3.5. So when we look at our team and we look at the average, do we have any averages or medians or measures of central tendency that are falling in those ranges? And that might suggest that our team might be more dominant in those areas. And again, if we do have clusters, we're going to also have holes. So how might those clusters and how might those holes impact team interpersonal relations, work process, and team meetings? What situation, if any, could potentially cause conflict? Which team members could feel left out or excluded? So do we have any outliers unless we pay close attention to their point of view or their preferences? And then again, what do our average team results reveal? So those are just a few points of discussion or thought when you actually start to tackle the analysis and you're really trying to evaluate a team's composition. So let's move to an example. This is an example of a fictitious company, Verum Analytics, and this is their leadership team. And you'll see here it says leadership team full detail. So, the left hand, you'll see on the left-hand side, we've got on the y-axis, we've got 1 through 10, and that corresponds with the TQ16 scale, 1 to 10. And then on the x-axis at the bottom, you'll see the various personality traits. So 1 is going to be more solitary in the example of solitary and people-oriented, and 10 is going to be very people-oriented. So as you see, when we talked about the graph that Rachel showed, and this is kind of a flipped version of that graph, we had one data point associated with each trait. Now we've got 6 because this is a team of 6. So as we look across this graph, I just want to point out some of the points of areas of focus that I mentioned in the last couple of slides. First, you'll see we've got a cluster here around people-oriented. 5 out of our 6 team members score either 8 or above, which is pretty high, as we talked about, 7.5 or above. Those are really going to be what's considered as dominant or extreme scores. So what does that tell us? Well, this is probably a pretty social group. I would imagine when they get together in team meetings, there's a lot of chatter, of disclosure, perhaps of non-work related issues, which can be fantastic for team interaction. You've got a group of people that really like to come together and like to be around other people. On the flip side, some of the challenges could be that it could increase the time of those team meetings, as well as to increase frustration for the team member down here that's more solitary. So we talked about outliers. Here's an example of an outlier. This team member is much more solitary and they may have more difficulty feeling included in the group. They might not desire that same level of social interaction, and because of that they might come across as sort of aloof and even sort of disengaged, when in reality it's just a product of their natural tendency. They're not comfortable. So if the team's aware of that, they might not be as prone to think that person is aloof or not interested, and might say, you know what, when we have a team activity or team task where we need to come together as a group, let's try to focus some pieces of that process that will allow that individual to complete them individually. So they're still contributing to the team, but maybe not in as social of a way. Okay, as we move along the graph from left to right, the next area of interest is we've got this large hole here in the trait area of unconventional. So we've got a very, very highly conscientious team, which again is a very, very commonly desirable trait. It's a very desirable trait. In fact, conscientiousness might be one of the most desirable traits across all types of jobs and all levels, because this trait is highly correlated with and associated with dutifulness, well-developed morale sense. At the same time, when you do have individuals that are highly conscientious, they might have difficulty being a little bit more unconventional when that might be a need in a particular situation. So that's one of the, when we talk about holes, it's good when you're interpreting these results to look at where those holes are and say, okay, is that an area where perhaps it might make sense when we're beginning to look out and hire more members of this team, if we could see that there being some benefit to having a little dash of unconventionalism within our team. This is a great collection of data where you could then assess people against that personality instrument and see if you could pull some people in to help sort of fill that gap. Okay, there's another hole over here with change orientation. So this is a very, very conservative team. This is not going to be a group that's going to enjoy the idea of things not remaining the way that they have been. When you mix that with the other fact that they are very, very conscientious, you could see how potentially they could get stuck in status quo. Now, again, this is all situational. It might be that the business is at a point where it doesn't really need their leadership to be very change oriented. Chances are, though, if we're looking at a leadership team, these are the individuals that should be driving and supporting change and helping to push that change and that acceptance of that change throughout the organization. So again, this might lend itself to that team saying, you know, we recognize this about ourselves. What can we do to gain more of a comfort level with change? Or do we need to perhaps rely on bringing in some individuals that do have are more change oriented so that we don't have this big hole that might be hindering us from being as effective as we could be? And the last thing I want to point out is what I refer to as, we refer to as cluster splits. So we've really got two clusters here, where in the example of solitary and people-oriented, we had really one cluster and one outlier. Here we've actually got two clusters. We've got half the team that's very, very detail-oriented, and we've got half the team that's very, very unorganized. Now you can imagine this could create a ton of frustration. That being said, it also offers some opportunity, because if the team's aware that there are people that it's just naturally more difficult for them to be organized, they may have a little bit more leniency when dealing with them. And when the team is faced with an exercise, a task, or any sort of team deliverable that might require the need for detail orientation, and perhaps somebody that's unorganized is leading that effort for whatever reason, maybe they need to pull in one of the more detail-oriented team members to review that work. And I think this is, again, this is where, as Rachel said, you might not be able to change what your natural tendencies are as it relates to your personality composition. If you're aware and you have that increased level of self-awareness and emotional intelligence, you can help to develop processes as well as rely on other team members to compensate for areas that might not be a natural strength for you. And then that's going to limit those situations where the final product delivered by the team is going to suffer because of an individual's weakness, without them being able to say, hey, I know this is a weakness, you know this is a weakness, I really need your help, can I get a second set of eyes on this? And then finally, we've talked about sort of the individuals and how they play and how individual personalities and the way that they are distributed across the continuums can lend themselves to areas of analysis and evaluation in terms of effectiveness. The team median or mean, whichever, in this case, we're going to be using the median to take out those outliers. Those also are going to tell us what our team overall, what's that overall team personality. So as a leadership team, you'll see, going back to our extreme scores, we are people-oriented, conscientious, and conservative. So again, you can kind of see the holes here because you can see where that change orientation, there's nothing really up here. We've got a really low score there, so we're very, very conservative. We're also very, very highly conscientious, and we're people-oriented. What if we've got a group, a younger team, a younger management team kind of coming up through the ranks that's extremely change-oriented? Well, you could see how that could cause some friction. If this is our executive leadership team, we're not change-oriented, and we've got a group of individuals that are kind of coming up in the next blood of the organization, that are next leaders of the organization, that are very change-oriented. So that goes back to also not looking only at how we interact as team members within a team, but how our team personality may drive the way that we relate to other teams within the organization. Okay, so that concludes the slides and the presentation. We would love to hear if you all have any questions. Please feel free to type them in, and we'll give you a few minutes to do so, and then we can answer those for you. Okay, we do have one question. Is the webinar available to view again? Yes, it will be available to view again, and you'll be given that information. Any other questions? We do have a question. Somebody wanted to know, right, how do you train leaders of the organization to use individual and team results effectively? That's a great question. One of the things that we do when we're working with organizations that are going to be implementing these types of assessments and using them to either be used for individuals or used for teams is we do take them through this was a very sort of high level overview of the assessment. We're going to take them through a more in-depth overview so that they understand very, very comfortable with all of the traits. They're very comfortable with all of the methodology, and we also train them on how to deliver, if they're managers and they're going to be delivering the results to individuals, how to deliver that information in a way that's going to be well received and used to the best ability of the employees. When we take the teams through their team results, we really go through something that was very similar to what you saw today, and that's going to be walking them through. Again, they'll have a better understanding of the tool and of the traits, and then ideally it's great if you can also pull in some actual real-time issues that team is dealing with, and then apply those to taking the lens of our team's personality and how we might be more effective at getting through that particular challenge. So lots of times we'll like to actually pull things in, because then it's got more face validity, and people have a higher level of comfort with it when they're actually applying it to a real situation as opposed to a sort of a hypothetical situation.
Okay, let's take one more. We have actually more of a comment than a question, but let's address it. That says, I can't imagine that any extreme is good. I can definitely see where that kind of thought and approach would come from. It tends to be definitely a more extreme and less flexible version of a particular trait. However, really there's gosh, almost any trait. There are situations and jobs and scenarios where you can really leverage that. You need to spend more time thinking through what are the downsides of it. So if someone is extremely detail oriented, oh my gosh, there are days, I got to tell you, I need that person in my life to keep everything all buttoned up and tracked and together. And there's a lot of good executives that need such a detail oriented person. So that's a great example of them looking at the flip side, that the detail orientation we love about the person may also be what gets them stuck in the weeds, not see the forest for the trees. So you need the detail orientation, take advantage of it, but don't expect them to also be a big picture person as well. And it does circle back to the self-awareness. If you're not aware of how, I'm going back to the word extreme, but if you're not aware of the impact of that trait, it's going to definitely get in the way.
And interestingly, most people do have about 3 that fall into what we're calling extreme range, but fall above the 7 or below the 4. It's also the combination of all those traits as well, though, that can sort of help to mellow things out. Okay? Any other questions?
Let me do one more check. We were asked, what is your experience with implementation of this method? I'm hesitating only if I could ask whoever typed that question to maybe type in a little more clarification. Are you referring to kind of the team approach, implementing that? If I can pause 1 second and let's see what the feedback is. Okay. So have you experienced organizations and teams affecting change based on these types? Yes.
Yeah.
That, you know what, Barbara, you probably ought to lead with that one.
Yeah, and in terms of, yes, there are, if this is answering the question correctly, have you experienced organizations or teams affecting change based on these types of evaluations? Absolutely. And I think one of the biggest changes that you'll have is that through gaining an understanding, teams are much, much better, for instance, in those team meetings as sort of reeling things in, reeling people in that kind of tend to fly off the cuff. And then you lose that level of people sort of taking offense to it, because then you going back to that common language. So it can make team processes run a lot more smoothly. It can also help that team to better allocate resources according to natural strengths and weaknesses, again, without people getting their feelings hurt, if you will, or people feeling like things are being taken away from them. Because if you've gone through this type of exercise, individuals are going to, most of the time, and I would say almost 10 times out of 10 when we've delivered this, people are very, very comfortable and in agreement with the results. And if anything, it sort of sheds some light and helps people understand, okay, that's why I've struggled for so long with organization. I really am, this is part of my personality makeup. And you know what? It's made me more comfortable. Now you know it. Maybe you'll cut, I don't want to say cut me some slack, but help me to try to compensate for that in other ways. So that's the type of change it drives. Generally, it's going to drive just the team operating more smoothly, more effectively, more efficiently, and the interpersonal dynamics with the team. People just have a greater understanding of where everybody's coming from.
Okay, I've got 2 more questions here. Let us start with, do you think self-awareness provides you any insight into perhaps better understanding the personalities of others? And I think absolutely it does. First of all, just general, it's kind of that emotional intelligence and understanding and being sensitive to different sorts of people. So even understanding yourself and understanding that, hey, not everyone is like you, and that there's positive spins to all other kinds of personalities, it does help with that awareness, as well as being more sensitive to values of different personality traits.
And I give the example, and I can do this because I'm high on self-disclosing. But for those of us that might fall a little bit higher on the controlling and gregarious scale, just hypothetically, an example would be if you've got somebody that understands that they tend to sort of dominate meetings, and they have people have been frustrated with that. If that person becomes aware of it and everybody kind of gives the nod, yeah, John, you do tend to sort of dominate meetings. John can then sort of take a deep breath prior to a meeting and maybe have a moment and say, you know what, I'm not going to talk until I'm the third, and John's not Barbara, Rachel, so stop pointing at me. I'm not going to talk until 3 people talk before me. And that's a behavior. That's an actionable behavior. But in doing that, it's going to help John not to come across as dominant.
I can give another great example. This was a really fun session we facilitated with a group of executives, and looked at, this is a tight group of executives who worked together many years and very successfully, and looked at kind of all their different traits and how they map out together, similar to what Barbara showed us and walked through with us today. And so, gosh, going into it, you think about how similar they all must be. They've worked together so much for so long, and it was not at all. And even traits where they were clustering, there would be someone who was a real outlier, and they'd say, you know what, that's why we turn to you for all the creative ideas. I get it. And that's why you then turn to us for kind of implementing it and making it happen. So that's, again, another way that the self-awareness can really kick in. Okay, another question. Can you use these for new employees to help them define a career path within the organization? And I'm going to answer that a little bit quickly. We actually intentionally kind of stayed away from the employee selection and placement into different jobs, simply because historically we've done more of that and wanted to try to provide something newer for those of you that were more familiar with our assessment. But the answer is yes, and you can do that a number of different ways, and one of those ways is kind of setting profiles or benchmarks of what success looks like in different positions, so that you can help to see how well an individual would fit in a different role, particularly when that role, sometimes it is just a promotion. Are they going to go straight up the career ladder? Sometimes it's, I've worked with organizations where they have almost several different silos of specialties. So are you the right sort of person who would be successful in kind of a parallel move, that you could then learn the skills necessary in that other role, and then you add more value to the organization because you've got a broader lens and a broader knowledge base to help you become a stronger leader. Yep. So we can talk more about that one another time. I don't, like I said, want to focus too much on the selection side with everyone. I think that's it. If anyone has any other questions, please reach out to us. You can send a general email to tqinfo@talentquest.com, or of course specifically to me. This is Rachel Finglass or Barbara Mackintosh, and would be glad to continue the discussion offline. Thanks for all your time today.
Thanks, guys.